The Certainty Principle, Chapter 12, Section 12.2, the Dunning-Kruger Effect. And here there's an illustration, as you can probably see, of a curve called the Dunning-Kruger curve. The cognitive bias with which human brain assesses reality, particularly self-assessment and self-competency, is known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. The phenomenon observed by Dunning and Kruger was that most individuals are unable to objectively evaluate their own competencies. Justin and Dunning, 1999. Now, if upon reading this you find your internal voice saying, "Of course, that's most people, but I am not most people," your identity's desperate need to self-justify is, in fact, validating the DKE hypothesis. So if you look at the curve, one example of Dunning-Kruger is that approximately 80% of all drivers perceive their driving skills to be above average, which is, of course, impossible, right? It's impossible to statistics. So most people overestimate their own competencies in any given area. What Dunning-Kruger discovered in their investigation was that people of low competency tend to achieve this very high level of confidence early on. So if you look at the graph, you'll notice that in competence acquisition, there's an early stage where people think, "I'm great, I got this, I got it figured out." But then as they learn more, assuming they do learn more, they have the experience of saying, "I suck at this." A great example I can think of from my own life is when I was a kid, I bought a motorcycle and had never ridden a motorcycle in the past, really, to any extent. But bought a motorcycle when I turned 16, much to my mother's dismay. And after about the first few days, I felt that I really had this thing. I really knew how to do it. Seemed very easy, in fact. And I became more and more confident, maybe even overconfident in the way I rode, until I had an experience where I dropped the bike. I dropped it a couple of times, but the one time that really woke me up was when a truck pulled in front of me, and I was in some gravel at an intersection. But what was interesting is when I went to get insurance, the insurance was extremely high for a 17-year-old kid, almost 17-year-old kid on a motorcycle, as you can imagine. And the insurance agent explained to me that most motorcycle accidents would happen within the first 6 months. So my rate might go down a little later, but at least initially it was very high. So the actuarials on Dunning-Kruger are very stark. There's a risk associated with this notion that people feel early on when they're learning something new that they're competent. And it's worth keeping in mind, because when you know that, when you're learning something new, recognize the fact that that sense of "I got this" is really a fantasy. And that you will soon, as you get deeper into learning any new skill, have that sort of moment like I did when I dropped my motorcycle. I guess I really don't know everything I need to know about doing this. Interestingly, as competency develops into expertness or expert level, there's a sense that people become confident in what they're doing, but they still feel like they have a lot to learn. And this is really the stage of mastery. Masters always, may look amazing, even magical to us on the outside, but on the inside, they're like, "Yeah, I got a lot to learn about this." And if you read about any of the famous masters in art, you'll hear that story over and over again. So, and again, interestingly, if upon reading this you think you're the exception, you're really just proving the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is that most people reactively, reflexively think, "Yeah, I'm not that guy." All observations are distorted through the lens of identity, particularly self-observation. There's no escaping the distortion, save it detaching myself from the biases I've accumulated over time, known collectively as identity. The dangers of the DKE-driven identity are obvious, as I've already illustrated. When identity rules reason, differing opinions are reflexively rejected. So often criticism or non-conforming ideas that you hear about competency are rejected emotionally, because they conflict with your identity. When identity rules reason, differing opinions are reflexively rejected. Reflexively means automatic, just like when you tap your knee and it bounces up. Ad hominem, which means personal attacks or personal commentary. Ad hominem, identity-based judgments dominate choices. Somebody passes you on the road, you say, that guy's a jerk. That's kind of an ad hominem-based judgment. Dominate choices that would otherwise be based on objective evaluations for an individual's actions and arguments. Facts are distorted to fit the identity narrative in my head. Of all human behaviors, then, identity maintenance, really the intelligent use of the brain's certainty-seeking function, question, or is identity just the easy, low-risk way of insulating myself from the immense uncertainty of the external world? I would say the latter. Furthermore, does the brain's enthrallment with identity inhibit intelligent human behavior? Question mark. I would say yes. The Turing test evaluates if a machine's ability to exhibit intelligent behavior is indistinguishable from that of a human. This leads to the question, what is intelligent human behavior? Which human behaviors are intelligent and which are not? In the certainty principle, I make the assumption that human behaviors driven by reasoning are intelligent, and that behaviors driven by identity seeking are not. Further, I define identity as my brain's tendency to create and conflate stories about itself to fill the void of the inscrutability of its own meaning. Yeah, so it should be self-evident, but I go over it again. The brain cannot figure itself out. The brain cannot figure the reality within which it perceives, right? It's limited to its own domain. And that inscrutability, its inability to figure itself out, creates a little bit of desperation, almost a crisis in some people. And that crisis has to be satisfied. It's satisfied with identity. That is making the picture and story of myself my prime meaning, which is, of course, a fantasy. Show me yourself. My anger at not winning the lottery, even though I am good, a good, hardworking person who's bought many tickets, may be a good story and even sound justified, but it is not good reasoning. My categorical judgment of a person based on, say, their political views may feel right, but it is reliably irrational. A computer exhibiting this kind of behavior might be perceived as humanoid, but not adult humanoid, or not identity-free humanoid. My laptop becoming petulant or angry when it wasn't getting the bandwidth it desired would be entertaining for a time, but in a very short time. My brain passes the Turing test when the intelligent qualities of human behavior prevail, characterized by an immunity to the influence of identity seeking. If my laptop's CPU becomes preoccupied with its comparative performance versus other of its species, I have a problem. Should its CPU become enthralled with creating self-deprecating stories about its own inadequacies, I suspect it would lose its value to me altogether. Why should it be different from my brain? In effect, I observe some of this behavior already when my computer maintenance programs show me an unhappy face, when its story becomes too encumbered by all the stuff accumulated over the course of normal operation. The difference is, I can click a button on my laptop and it is purged. Unfortunately, my brain lacks such a specific maintenance routine, and bad code, that is not exactly true. There are maintenance routines. I call it the certainty principle. And bad code can run on unencumbered without my willful intervention. The stories my brain concocts about itself, masquerading as identity, tend to perpetuate to the point that my interpretation of normal daily experience becomes conflated with the stories that my brain has already fabricated about itself. It fills in the memory gaps with pattern formation, and voila, here's my brain's story of me, my identity. Consider my lifelong disdain for pistachio ice cream. I am not a nut person, quote unquote. I've loved peanut butter since childhood, but disliked all other nuts, particularly nuts in ice cream. So, never having tried pistachio, bright green no less, the mere thought of pistachio ice cream seemed, well, especially repulsive. Despite my wife's repeated encouragement to try it, I denied myself this green treat for more than 50 years. Once I finally relented, you guessed it. Turned out I love pistachio ice cream. Ice cream makers aside, my position on pistachio prejudice was of little importance to anyone save the needless decades of self exposed exile from Nutland. But the consequences of identification with any position is limiting, even destructive. Delusional self evaluation, see the Dunning Kruger effect, particularly regarding safety, produces bad outcomes. Yeah, because we become extremely risk averse. We want to stay in our safe place. In my 40s, I was a heavy drinker. I couldn't get through the day without a bottle at my desk, after draining it before the day's end. I identified myself with whiskey, and I was convinced I was functionally better for consuming it. I concocted an internal story identifying myself with famous functional drinkers, real and fictional. Ulysses S. Grant, Ernest Hemingway, Alexander the Great, my father. I'd embellished my addiction with stories of heroes who drank and prospered. I did all this right up to the point that one night while speeding home in the dark on a dark country road, I careened into a ditch a mere milliseconds away from running over a child who shot out in front of my car on a bicycle. Over time, my stories became so deeply embedded that they filter and distort my experiences and judgments, as is with the drinking. Identity run amok can come to dominate reality itself, building me up, tearing me down, or confusing me altogether, based on prevailing identity of the moment. Be it virtuous or afflictive, once identity dominates, independence and accountability recede. And with them, so does my awareness of time and consequence, the measure of which I call temporal perspective. I reference the horizon component of the certainty principle. Your horizons are forever, and we'll get back to that.